Hi, I'm Josh, and do you want to know why I am so grateful to you? It is because you saw how long this video is, and you still clicked on it. That's amazing. And if you've also taken the time to subscribe to my YouTube channel, then I don't even know what to say. I just don't deserve you. So thanks for being here, thanks for watching, thanks for supporting what I do. And let's get right into talking about the first trilogy in the Sevenwaters series by Juliette Marillier. These three books consist of Daughter of the Forest, Son of the Shadows, and Child of the Prophecy. There is apparently another trilogy beyond this that completes the entire 6-book Sevenwaters series, although this trilogy is a complete story arc, and then the second trilogy is its own story arc as well, from what I understand. But let's start talking about this particular trilogy. The person responsible for me getting into Sevenwaters is one of my favorite booktubers, and that is Yolene from Yolene Reads. In one of my past videos, I was talking about the kind of fantasy that I really crave, and that is fantasy that's in this kind of light, magical world. Think along the lines of Rivendell or Lothlorien from the Lord of the Rings series. This wonderful, magical forest with fey creatures and just all kinds of fun stuff happening. I am not as much, or at least I wasn't as much, into the whole idea of grimdark before I started reading the first law and completely changed my mind on that. What I really wanted was this very pleasant escapist fantasy, and Yolene talks about how Daughter of the Forest is her #1 book of all time, and she was describing the type of book this is that seemed to fit what I was looking for. And sure enough, when I started reading Daughter of the Forest, I realized, yes, this is the type of thing that has this magical forest filled with these kind of strange spirit creatures and rings of mushrooms that you step into them and magical things might happen. And then below the surface of the physical world, there's this fey realm of these kind of magical ancient creatures that were there prior to humanity. So it's all of this stuff that I was really looking for and really definitely met my expectations when I read Daughter of the Forest. Now, in terms of what it's about, we have in these 3 books a series of events that follow 3 generations. So Daughter of the Forest follows the youngest of 7 siblings, a girl named Sorka, and a sorceress comes into the lives of this family and really kind of wreaks mayhem, and it is up to Sorka to kind of undo the curses that have been placed upon the family by the sorceress. So we follow a plot line that is heavily inspired by an old folk tale. I think it was called The Seven Swans or something like that. I'll have to post it here because I don't remember off the top of my head. But it is definitely inspired by kind of this old folk tale, fairy tale story. And that initially didn't have me too excited because I'm not super big into fairy tales and fairy tale inspired things, but it certainly worked out really well with this series. So we have Sorka, this young girl who is trying to undo the curses, and then in the next book, Son of the Shadows, we follow one of Sorka's daughters, Leodan, and the storyline sort of continues following her. And then as we get into Child of the Prophecy, we have one of Leodan's nieces. Her name is spelled Fainne. I'll put the pronunciation here because, again, I don't quite recall the correct pronunciation of that name. So we have 3 generations in 3 books, and each of the books individually I would describe as being almost a standalone story, although there are storylines and narrative that kind of carries on through all 3 books. So while you could read Daughter of the Forest as its own book, you wouldn't get a complete resolution on everything that is happening there. It would feel almost like a complete story, but there would be some threads left dangling there that you would have to continue with the rest of the series to resolve, essentially. But anyways, Juliette Marillier's writing is just so beautiful. And I'll give you just one quick example here from Daughter of the Forest. And it says, Picture, then, a valley folded in green, where gentle swaths of ash and beech are broken here and there by the stronger forms of oaks, still clad in their bright autumn raiment. Along the valley floor undulates a shining river, its banks soft with drooping willows. The path follows the line of the river, curving this way and that between well-tended fields, past cottages and sheepyard, byre and barn. So the way these stories are written really draws the reader into this wonderful, magical, sort of medieval-inspired setting that is full of forests and nature and magic. And you can tell that Juliette Marillier is very knowledgeable about these ancient folk tales that arose out of this kind of era of Ireland. And what's interesting is that throughout the books, there are several times where the characters are sitting around perhaps a fire in the evening, and they are telling each other stories. And these stories are obviously old folk tales from these ancient times. And it really feels like I said, that Juliette Marillier is knowledgeable about some of these ancient Irish tales, because the stories within themselves are kind of interesting, even if they aren't necessarily directly related to the entire narrative being told in the books. The stories on their own are very interesting and a very neat aspect of the books that really helps to draw the reader into that particular setting. Now, it's not 100% perfect. The thing with really blasting through 3 novels in very quick succession is that you tend to naturally pick up on repetitive aspects of an author's writing. You just kind of can't help it when you are reading through a lot of books very quickly. And one thing that really started to kind of grate on me in the second book, Son of the Shadows, is, well, there were 2 things that just kept coming up over and over again. So if you wanted to stay well hydrated as you were reading Son of the Shadows, take a sip of water every time that Juliette Marillier mentions and describes a character's pale face. Also, take a sip of water every time that she talks about a character having a sleepless night. It's a wonder that a character could function with the amount of sleepless nights that were happening here in Son of the Shadows. So things like that just end up becoming kind of repeated over and over again throughout a book. When you're reading it quickly, kind of jump to the forefront. But those are very minor things and did not necessarily take away from my enjoyment of the stories. As always, too, there were little nitpicks I have because of my interest in medieval arms and armor and ancient combat. And I should mention, speaking of that the story does have a historical setting. It takes place in Ireland in the 9th century, in the 800s, during the reign of a particular king. There's every so often something that I'll kind of go, that's not quite right, in my most nerdy manner possible. Well, actually... And here's just one real quick example. There's one group of warriors that's being confronted by a second group of warriors, and it says, "The archer stood back, his bow drawn. It was clear that, while they might choose to have each his turn with the Briton, there could be but one end result." And I have mentioned this actually in a previous book, where fantasy authors love to have their archers keeping people at bow point, I guess, for lack of a better word. Sort of like keeping them at gunpoint, but with their bows. And when you're talking about these medieval longbows, these big, powerful war bows, they're not the type of thing where you can just hold indefinitely on somebody to threaten them. As fun and dramatic as it is in a story, I mean, when you draw back a bow, you're releasing it almost immediately because of the power of that bow and the amount of strength it takes just to draw it. So it's just one of those things that fantasy authors seem to like to do that just makes me go, maybe you should talk to somebody like me who knows a bit about medieval combat. But one thing that I did think was cool about these books is that they each follow a main character who is a young female character. And what's also interesting is that each of these characters has a particular skill in healing. It's something that kind of is passed on from generation to generation within this family, is the magical arts of healing. And I thought, wow, it's so cool to have fantasy books that follow the healer in the group rather than the warrior and the fighter. And I really love that about these books, especially as somebody who worked for 16 years as a paramedic. It's kind of in my nature to lean towards the healers rather than the dealers of violence and pain and death which tend to be the primary focus of so much fantasy. So I thought that was really, really cool. And yes, they are female characters in a world that is difficult for women, and here's a couple of examples. Since that night, when she had learned that it is men who make decisions and women who must follow them, my sister had not once mentioned Ciaran. And the other example here, who was I but one more powerless woman in a world of unthinking men? Nothing had changed, nothing at all, save deep inside where nobody could see. So, as was the case throughout almost the entirety of human history, women were really kind of powerless in this world, and yet we do follow some females who have powers of their own, which I think is really neat. Now, that's not to say there's not a lot of violence and conflict throughout these books, because yes, that is the kind of world we're in here. And there are some really interesting statements made about fighting for a cause against your neighbors. And so here are a few passages that I'll quote quickly. One character says, "Father says the Britons are to be feared." And another character replies and says, "He fears what he does not understand." And isn't that the case constantly, that lack of understanding of our fellow humans leading to suspicion and fear and ultimately violence? This idea is carried forward in the next quote here. "It becomes easy," Finbar said. "It's in the training, the ability to see your enemy as something other than a real man. He is a lesser breed, defined by his beliefs. You learn to do with him what you will and bend him to your purpose." And again, that's just the same thing throughout all of human history when it comes to wars and fighting against other people. The fact that you really have to dehumanize a person in order to make it easier to kill them. And that's something that just never changes. And it's easy to do when they have different beliefs than us, as is mentioned in that particular quote. Again, taking this a step further, once again we have two characters speaking. The first one says, "Spare me your homespun faith," said Simon wearily. "I despise it, and you." "You are hardly in a position to throw it back in his face," said Finbar mildly. "He cares for you and your kind because of that very faith. Without it, he might be a killer like my kinsman, and perhaps like you." "Indeed, I was once just such a man. I know the power of a cause and how it can blind you to reality." We do have to be careful about the beliefs that become entrenched within us. And the final thought that goes along with those is this. In Cormac's case, it was probably lack of imagination that helped him cope. That was not kind of me, I suppose, but Cormac tended to see the world in black and white, and in some ways this made life easier for him. And if you've followed my videos, that's just a point that I've harped on over and over again, is humanity's natural inclination to seeing everything in black and white, because that is how we're kind of evolutionarily made and developed, and what helps us to kind of make sense of the world. It is much more complicated to view everything in shades of gray. It makes it easier to act in certain ways when you can see everything in black and white. So those points I found to be very interesting when it comes to the idea of humans in conflict with each other, warring against each other, and causing pain and death to each other. Another thing I liked about these books is the kind of examination of the old faiths of this ancient Ireland, this connection to nature and to each other. And so I'm going to read a few quotes that kind of illustrate these points here. And in this case, they're comparing the old ways to this brand new religion of Christianity that has arrived in Ireland. And it says, "The Druids were all slain or banished over there. The power of the new faith was great, backed up with a generous purse and with lethal force. How could it fail?" And isn't that true about the spread of Christianity being backed up by wealth and by violence? Two of the things that were absolutely abhorred by Jesus, the founder of Christianity. So here is the next quote. And once again, this is a contrast between the old ways and the arrival of Christianity. It says, "Man sets his hand to games of power and influence. He quests for far horizons and wealth beyond imagining. He thinks to own what cannot be possessed. He hews the ancient trees to broaden his grazing lands. He mines finds the deep caves and topples the standing stones. He embraces a new faith with fervor and, perhaps, with sincerity. But he grows ever further from the old things. He can no longer hear the heartbeat of the earth, his mother. He cannot smell the change in the air. He cannot see what lies beyond the veil of shadows. Even his new God is formed in his own image, for do they not call him the Son of Man? By his own choice he is cut adrift from the ancient cycles of sun and moon, the ordered passing of the seasons, and without him the fair folk dwindle and are nothing. This idea of the loss of the connection with the earth is carried on in the next quote here. Indeed, if I heeded the voices of those who called themselves old ones, the failure to win the islands this time would signify no less than the passing of the great races of Erin, the fair folk, the older folk, the many and strange otherworld dwellers beneath the surface of things. As for the humankind, they would lose forever the mysteries of the spirit. What sort of man or woman could you call yourself without those? They would cease to be guardians of earth and ocean, and become no more than parasites living off them, with no heed for what it meant, with no regard for the sacred trust laid on them. And how far have we come as humans in the use and abuse of the planet and its resources? Here we look at some further problems of the arrival of Christianity. I did not understand the Christian way. My studies suggested to me it was somewhat lacking in respect for the things that are, for the power of earth and sun, the force of water, and the purity of air. Those are the cornerstones of the old faith, for without them, without the knowledge of moon and stars, without the understanding of all existences, how could one make any sense of things at all? We are a part of those wonders, tied to them as a newborn child is tied to its mother. If we do not know them, we do not know ourselves. As for the human folk, we are a small part in the long way of it, so small, yet each of us is precious, a jewel of great worth, and each of us is different. And there's just one more that I'll read here quickly. There will come a time, soon enough, when even that ancient wood will fall to the axe to grant man his grazing land, his settlements, his towers and walls. He thinks in his ignorance to tame the very earth, to force the very ocean to his will, and so he will lay waste the body of the mother who gave him birth, and will not know what he does. The old ways will be forgotten, Fanny, no matter what we do. A new age begins, an age of darkness, in which those who walk the earth are cut off from the very things which give them life. How true that has turned out to be. There's also romance woven throughout these books. It is not necessarily a central element of the stories, but it is kind of a strong thread that's woven throughout the narrative, and it was really well done. I did enjoy the romance of these books, even though I'm not a romance reader. And along the way, the books make some interesting and some difficult points about love and hope and trust. And I'm going to read some quick quotes again here that really spoke to me personally because of what I've experienced in my life, which I will not get into for your sake here. Let me just go straight to the books. And I thought, is Finbar right? Can this be love that twists and tears the heart so? Does love give nothing but the power to hurt each other? Is this what makes the simplest touch blend longing and terror in equal measure? Whatever this is, it feels like a mortal wound. And then, I think you are too harsh, said Father Brian, but he spoke kindly. You know not yet the sort of love that strikes like a lightning bolt, that clutches hold of you by the heart as irrevocably as death, that becomes the lodestar by which you steer the rest of your life. I would not wish such a love on anyone, man or woman, for it can make your life a paradise, or it can destroy you utterly. And let's just say it has destroyed me utterly, and we'll leave it at that. Well, actually, the next quote carries on that idea a bit. I wept in self-pity because I knew you could never go back. You chose your path, and that was it. If only I could go back. And then, here's a question that I do ask myself. Was the rest of my life to be lived thus, half awake, half alive, never fully complete? What had I done wrong to be thus cursed? And then from Son of the Shadows, if hope is gone, the future becomes barely worth contemplating. And then on to the idea of trust. Bran had dismissed trust once as a concept without meaning, but if you could not trust, you were indeed alone, for neither friendship nor partnership, neither family nor alliance could exist without it. Without trust, we were scattered far and wide, at the mercy of the four winds with nothing to cling to. And all that leads to something I relate to very much. What I longed for most was to be alone. The need to meet so many new people and smile and be polite had taken its toll on me. So there you go. We'll leave those depressing issues behind. And before I conclude this video and then talk about my rating, let me just say thank you so much to my Patreon supporters, especially to my higher tier supporters, Joanna, Paul, and Asmondas Perfect. You all, without even knowing it, carry me through my day-to-day existence here on YouTube, and you really do mean a lot to me, so thank you so much. Now let's talk about the last few quotes from the books here. And in this final section, I'll go back to the idea of the main characters in these three books being healers. And there are some interesting things talked about in terms of illness, healing, life and death, because again, this is something I relate to so much as a person whose entire life has been dominated by illness and pain, and it's just something that's been such a huge part of my life, and so I relate a lot to some of the things that are said in these books. And so let me just dive right into that. This one is talking about the main character trying to heal her sick sister, and it says, "For I knew the body must be healthy if the mind is to heal." And man, I've certainly discovered in my experience that physical health, my Crohn's disease, the mental health, my PTSD, depression, anxiety are so closely interlinked that if I can't heal the physical health and pain, then the mental health can't be dealt with. And if I can't get rid of the mental anxiety and depression, then the physical health just stays worse too, and it all just feeds off each other. And then even when I get to a point of healing and good health, the lasting mental trauma of dealing with all that pain and suffering and even near-death experiences takes such a mental toll. And here's a quote that sort of references that idea. "I used it to heal him, whether he knew it or not, but without his own faith in himself, it could go only so far. Until he could be convinced of a reason to live, we could not safely let him go, even if his body was well enough mended, for he would not last even the first night without us." And I so distinctly remember having recovered from my Crohn's disease after my first major surgery when I almost died, how I just spiraled into such a deep depression even though I had finally been free of pain for the first time in years. But I liked this next quote about being with people who are suffering. "That is dangerous, Leodon. Besides, did you not say yourself the past cannot be rewritten? I know the dangers. I am armed against them. Armed with love, Father. I do not seek to make these wounds vanish as if they had never been. I know he will always bear the scars. I cannot make his path grow broad and straight. It will always twist and turn and offer new difficulties. But I can take his hand and walk by his side." The thought of just having somebody to walk by my side as I go through all this stuff makes me kind of emotional just to think about that idea. Now, another concept that's related to all this that I feel very strongly about is the whole concept of physician-assisted death, or euthanasia. Essentially, taking a person who is facing a really difficult, painful death and helping to end their suffering, just as we would do with any pets who have reached a point where there's no other way to remove their suffering. It's something that I believe in very strongly for people, and interestingly enough, these books kind of discuss that idea to a certain extent. "Haven't you ever been tempted," he asked quietly, "when your patient is in pain and you know he cannot survive? It would be easy, wouldn't it, to make the drafts just a little stronger? So instead of suffering further, he simply sank into sleep and never woke." And without spoiling anything about the stories, this is something that does come up in interesting ways a couple of times, which, because of my own strong convictions in that particular area, I thought was really cool to see in these books. And I don't know how good a quote this is to end on, but this is the last little bit that I will read. When you've seen a little more of the real world, you will learn that everyone is expendable. There are no exceptions, be it skillful smith or hardened warrior or little healer girl. You suffer and die and are soon forgotten. Life goes on regardless. So there you go. There's a cheery little quote to wrap up my look at these books on. But let's talk about my rating of these books. And they are impacted a little bit by the sort of frustrating, kind of dark nature of some of the stories here. In the past, when I have rated a series, I've always rated the series as a single whole, because most series, trilogies, duologies, whatever, are one continuing story. So, for example, The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien himself considered it to be a single book, even though we think of it as a trilogy now. And so it's always made the most sense to me to rate this entire series as a whole. However, because the Sevenwaters trilogy, or the first trilogy in the Sevenwaters series, has almost a feel of three distinct books. Like I said, each one is a new generation, a new main character, and almost a standalone story within one long overarching narrative with threads that do continue from book to book. It made more sense to me to rate each of these books individually. So when I read Daughter of the Forest, it was an easy 10 out of 10 for me. It just blew me away. And I thought, is this another fantasy series that is going to be rated higher than Lord of the Rings for me? Because the only other series previously that I have rated higher than Lord of the Rings, I think, is The Fiona of Our Tapestry by Guy Gavriel Kay, which at that time took me by surprise because I've kind of always assumed that nothing would surpass The Lord of the Rings in terms of my fantasy enjoyment. And so when The Fiona of Our Tapestry took that top spot, that took me by surprise, and I thought, hey, I wonder if Sevenwaters is going to be the second series to surpass Lord of the Rings. However, when I read Son of the Shadows, like I said, there were some kind of niggling things about the repetition of the way things were described and whatnot, and I decided it was more of a 9 out of 10 for me. So at that point, I was starting to think, well, maybe I shouldn't necessarily rate the trilogy as a whole. And then finally, when I read Child of the Prophecy, I enjoyed it the least of the three books, although I did enjoy it a lot, let me say that. But I found it frustrating because, yes, it was, again, about a young teenage girl, but the decisions that she was making throughout the book over and over again were just so frustrating. As the reader, with the knowledge we have of the whole story and the narrative being told, we could see that she just kept making bad decision after bad decision. And within the context of the story she was in and being a young girl and with the experience she had, it made sense that she was doing what she was doing. But as the reader, you just kept saying, why don't you just do this? What are you doing? And that was the story of the book over and over again, and it became kind of frustrating, and so it did impede my enjoyment of the book as a whole. Even though at the end I really enjoyed how everything was wrapped up in terms of the trilogy as a whole, I do really quite like how Child of the Prophecy ended. The process to get there was a little bit frustrating, and so ultimately I rated Child of the Prophecy an 8 out of 10, which is still a very, very high rating, but it certainly could have been better in terms of my overall enjoyment. So we have a 10 out of 10, a 9 out of 10, and an 8 out of 10. So if you want to average the series as a whole, let's call it a 9 out of 10. And we'll say it's not quite as good as Lord of the Rings, which I would rate very similarly, perhaps a 9 to 9.5 out of 10 for Lord of the Rings. And the best thing I can probably say about these three books is that it has been a long time since a book kept me up at night where I just didn't want to stop. I wanted to keep reading and reading and see what would happen next. And all three of these books were definitely keeping up at night. I read through them much more quickly than I would normally read through books. And so they did grip onto me and hold my interest. So that's all I'll say about Sevenwaters. Have you read these books? If so, what did you think of them? And if not, what have you been reading recently? I'm always interested in knowing what you're reading, what you're currently recommending. Please do let me know in the comments. And thanks so much for watching this long review of Sevenwaters. Oh my gosh, I am so glad somebody took the time to watch this video. If you could just do me one more favor and consider giving me a thumb up, maybe subscribe to my channel, or share the link to this video with somebody who you think would enjoy it, I would really appreciate that. Cheers. This connection to nature and to the... Until he could be convinced of a reason to live, he could not... Until he could be convinced of a reason to live, he could not safely... Oh my god. Which, because of my own strong convictions in that area, was something I found really... Which, because of my own strong conviction...